This week we're here at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts to interview world-renowned linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky. Someone who's authored over 100 books on everything from war to propaganda. I wanted to get his take on democracy and elections within the context of American empire. As extreme as the political spectrum is right now in the U.S., there's still almost complete uniformity on the war on terror, the stance toward Latin America, sanctions on Iran, and there's really no anti-war candidate, despite popular opinion agreeing on that. Why can no candidate touch that?
The spectrum is broad, but in an odd sense. The spectrum is basically from center to extreme right, way off the spectrum. So the Republican Party about 20 years ago basically abandoned any pretense of being a normal political party. In fact, distinguished, respected conservative commentators from the American Enterprise Institute, right-wing think tank, like Norman Ornstein, described the Republican Party as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary politics. They just don't want anything to happen. Their only policies are don't do anything or bomb. And that's not a political party. It's what happened is that the party, during the whole neoliberal period, both parties shifted to the right, as everywhere in the world, and the Republicans just went off the spectrum. They became so dedicated to the interests of the extreme wealthy and powerful that they couldn't get votes. So they had to turn to other constituencies, which are there, but were never politically mobilized. Christian evangelicals, nativists who are afraid they're taking our country away from us, people who are so terrified that they have to carry a gun into a coffee shop, and that's their base, essentially. And when you look at just take a look at the primaries. I mean, any candidate who has a semblance of rationality is not even competing. So that's the Republicans. The Democrats have shifted to the right as well. Today's mainstream Democrats are pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Somebody like Eisenhower, for example, would be considered way out on the left. So, for example, Eisenhower strongly made it very clear, as he put it, that anyone who questions the programs of the New Deal is just not part of American political life. Well, by now that's a left-wing program. It's basically Bernie Sanders' program. Yeah. That's Eisenhower. So the spectrum just is, it's true that it's broad, but in a very strange sense. As far as anti-war candidates are concerned, you have to ask what it means. So, for example, Obama is considered an anti-war candidate. He described the Iraq War as a mistake, a strategic blunder, as he put it. I mean, that's like Russian generals in Afghanistan in the early 1980s who criticized the invasion as a strategic blunder. That's not criticism of the war. It's saying you're making a mistake. The debate about the Obama's is running a global terror program of a kind that has never been envisioned before, the drone program. It's now being discussed to an extent because of recent leaks, but the questions that are being raised overwhelmingly, I mean, not by Jeremy Scale and Glenn Greenwald, but by most of those who are talking about it, is are you killing too many civilians? What about just assassinating people because you think someday they might want to harm you? I mean, suppose, for example, that Iran was murdering people in the United States because they think, with some reason, that they might want to harm them. For example, the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post, who publish articles, op-eds, calling for bombing of Iran. So suppose they said, well, this is an imminent threat, let's kill them. Would we accept that? The idea that we have the right to use force and violence at will is accepted pretty much across the spectrum. Now take, say, the Iran negotiations. Virtually everyone, president, political leaders, commentators in the press, dovish commentators, almost universally say that if we unilaterally think we detect some Iranian violation of the agreements, then we have a right to use military force to attack them. I mean, that's just outlandish in terms of international law and practice, but it's universal, virtually universal. You have to go way to the margins to find somebody who will question that.
And there's not even a mild critique of the assassination program or even the war on terror, the premise, from any of these candidates. And every 4 years, we're made to feel like we're playing this great role, this great democratic practice, in decision-making where we celebrate electing these leaders who rule over us. I mean, how does power really function in our society?
But there's very good studies of this from mainstream political science, nothing on the edges. So one of the main topics that's studied in academic political science is the relation between people's attitudes and public policy. And it's a pretty straightforward study. You see public policy, there's very good polling evidence on what people think about things. So, for example, for about 40 years, a considerable majority of the public has thought that taxes should go up on the rich, taxes go down on the rich. A substantial part of the public, often a big majority, thinks that we ought to have a national health care program. Nothing, impossible. In fact, when the press discusses this, they call it politically impossible, meaning the pharmaceutical companies won't accept it, the insurance companies won't accept it, and so on. So it basically doesn't matter what the public thinks. About 70% of the public, lowest 70% on the income scale, are pretty much disenfranchised. Their attitudes have no detectable influence on the policies of their own representatives. As you move up the scale, you get a bit more influence. When you get to the top, policy's made, and the top can mean a fraction of 1%. So it's kind of a plutocracy with democratic forms. And the elections, by now it's almost become a joke, but it's always been true that campaign financing plays a very substantial role in not only who's elected, but what the policies are. That goes back 100 years. The great campaign manager 100 years ago, Mark Hanna, was asked once, what are the important things that you have to run a campaign? He said there are three things. First one's money. The second one's money. And I forget what the third one is. And pretty much that's true. With the current reactionary Supreme Court, it's just gone out of sight. Campaign spending is, the billions and billions of dollars.
And people have argued it's just because of too much government interference. We need to widen the market. We need capitalism to be more free. I mean, you've argued that in any scenario of capitalism working, it's incongruous, it's incompatible with democracy.
There was recently an IMF study, International Monetary Fund, study of the profits of the big banks in the United States. The financial sector has become enormous during the neoliberal period. It's almost half the profit of corporate profit. Now, where does their profit come from? Turns out it comes from the taxpayer. Largely through the, there's an implicit government guarantee against failure. It's not in law, but it's understood that if a major financial institution gets into trouble, the government will bail it out, which happens repeatedly. Only during the neoliberal period, incidentally. There were no major failures during the 50s and the 60s, when the neoliberal policies began to be instituted, deregulation and so on. Then you start getting a series of financial crises. And every time the public bails them out. Well, that has consequences. For one thing, it means that the credit agencies understand that these corporations are high valued beyond the level of what they actually do, because they're going to be bailed out. So they get good credit ratings. It means they can get cheap credit. They can get cheap loans from the government. They can, of course, they get the bailouts. They can undertake risky transactions, which are profitable, because if it goes wrong, the taxpayer will take care of it. Net result is that amounts to practically all their profits. Is that capitalism? Energy. There was another IMF study of government subsidies to energy corporations around the world, not just the U.S. They estimated about, I think, $5 trillion a year, which includes the U.S., of course. Plenty of subsidies. Agribusiness subsidies.
But isn't that what the whole new libertarian movement would tell you, is that precisely the government is being used as an extension of the market to protect this kind of like irregular form of capitalism that's hand in glove with the government, and we just need to kind of free up government regulation and let capitalism work on its own?
First of all, the business world would never tolerate that. They rely heavily on government. But if you did follow the libertarian prescription, what are called remember, what's called libertarian in the United States has nothing to do with traditional libertarianism. It's a kind of ultra-right capitalist, anarcho-capitalism, they call it. If that was allowed to function, the whole society would collapse, and we turn to total tyranny. We would have tyranny of unaccountable private institutions. Private concentration of capital is totally unaccountable to the public. It's absolute tyranny. The only thing that protects the public from predatory capitalism is some degree of state intervention. So it's true that the state intervention does support the capitalist institutions. It also protects the society from total destruction. A predatory capitalist system it simply couldn't survive. For perfectly obvious reasons. For one thing, it wouldn't care about externalities, effects on others. So within no time, it would destroy the environment simply by destroying resources, pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Who cares? Furthermore, there would be no public goods. The markets, there's an ideology which claims that markets provide freedom of choice, so they're kind of democratic. That's not true, and we all know it's not true. So, for example, suppose I want to get home this evening. The market does offer choices. A Ford or a Toyota doesn't offer the choice I want, which is a public transportation system. That's not part of the market. The market focuses you on individual consumption of consumer goods, period. Is that what you want in life? Just more and more gadgets around? There are lots of other things in life which the market doesn't even offer. So what's called libertarianism is a prescription for complete disaster. I don't think the people advocating it understand this. I'm not criticizing them, but just think it through. And I should say it's very anti-libertarian. Traditional libertarianism, which was always on the left, was opposed to the master-servant relation, people giving orders and other people taking them. That's libertarianism, and not in this version.